So good afternoon. We continue, and we have two presentators here in person and two on the screen. So we'll start with Dr. Rachel Holmes. She has worked in activism, business, the arts, and the academy. She's the author of 4 books and the editor of many others. Her most recent work are Sylvia Pankhurst's Natural Born Rebel from Bloomsbury and Eleanor Marx from Bloomsbury too. She's currently writing a fictional trilogy about Lascarina Bubulina and her legacy, right? So she's going to talk to us about Proto-Feminist Philhellenism, how the Greek Revolution created a transnational women's rights movement.
Thank you.
I'm going to be a little bit strict with the ones that are here because we have 4 speakers.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And in this final session, I'd like to begin by saying what an absolute pleasure and privilege it's been to spend this time immersed with such generous experts in a specific history that I am relatively new to, but for the purposes of writing historical fiction, and to Michaelis and Roderick for making it possible. And I want to give particular thanks for papers that are especially pertinent to the work I am trying to do, and the conversations that they have prompted over the last few days. It's too long a list to name everyone, time doesn't allow, but I am confident that you will recognize the specific correspondences in the following remarks that I'm going to use my time for today. So for now, or rather, so now, some history from below. My contribution today is some thoughts on feminism, transnationalism, and the decisive role played by the 1821 Greek Revolution in engendering female commitment to the Philhellenic cause. I'm proposing that this revolution was a catalyst for the development of an interconnected transnational women's rights movement and, to some degree, early feminist political consciousness. Now, the networks of female Philhellenes have been increasingly well documented over recent decades, and thanks to this work, their contribution is beginning to become more widely acknowledged. Most of the Greek women who addressed female Philhellenes in the international arena were active educationalists, women's rights advocates. And as Dimitropoulos discovered, Greek women wrote to the Revolutionary Committee, spelling out their demands for what rights women should have in the new nation state the revolution would create. I sort of feel that I stand as if in a historical mirror. My reflections are a 21st century paradigm of how proto-feminist Philhellenes came to know and support the 1821 revolution, sometimes in response to the calls from their political sisters in Greece and its diaspora, and because it spoke to their own political interests. Like them, I am an eager volunteer, recently arrived, sharing common cause in the goals of feminist historiography. A simple summary of my methodology is cherchez la femme. Where is the woman? Seek her, find her. Transformational political movements for self-determination, declarations of independence, liberation from oppressors, collective demands for rights are fertile moments for the ideals of women's rights. The struggle for the rights, freedoms, and equality of women by women was at the heart and stomach of all Enlightenment-inspired revolutions, however short their outcomes fell. The unleashing of female agency, the revolt of women behaving in unwomanly, unconventional fashion, is one of the key motivations, I believe, for the fearful authoritarian suppression of revolutions, both at the time of their occurrence and in the historical record. We're familiar with motifs of martyrdom and needing to be saved, ubiquitous in revolutionary discourses. And thank you, Spiridulu, they've been discussed here this week. But iconic female figures, active in moments of rupture, embody the spirit of resistance and women's agency in social and political change. Exploring individual women's lives leads us to friendships, networks, and alliances. Laskarina Bubelina and Manto Mavrogenis are familiar figures who have long been romanticized and mythologized national and nationalist icons. Accounts of their lives are embellished, as Eleni Angelomati cogently reminds us in her work on women in the Greek War of Independence. My experience is that feminist historiography is always rewarded by returning to women hidden in plain view, particularly when we think we know them. The Bubelina Mavrogenis diptych is significant because during their lifetimes they became recognizable figures to radical women across a global, increasingly interconnected women's rights network. And indeed, the Society for Hellenism and Philhellenism website reminds us that Bubelina and Mavrogenis shared the same faith in the vision that Greece would be free in the end. This dynamic dipole was projected as a model in Western public opinion. Dynamic Philhellenism, as we have heard this week, inspired people, regardless of gender or nationality, motivating interest in idealized classical values and ideals. It created an opportunity for women from diverse social and ethnic backgrounds to meet, correspond, and organize. Women participated in many of the organizations established in the USA and Europe, as well as being actively involved in male-led local committees and effectively organizing most of them. Women established their own autonomous groups. As amongst the anti-slavery abolitionists and cross-class campaigners for male and female suffrage, there was some permeability of class barriers. Radical women already organized transnationally in the abolitionist movement. Again, we've have talked about this a lot this week. Against the transatlantic slave trade, more quickly recognized, in some cases, the resonance of the plight of women captured and traded in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. We have useful records of elite, educated women with social power who influenced politically and economically. Equally, many less privileged women organized and participated in Philhellenic committees. Faith-based, thank you for what you said earlier, Alistair, and church communities were significant hubs of this organization, as were radical women connected by pamphlets, journals, and again, as much discussed this week, increasingly democratizing print culture. Philhellenic influence traveled far, connecting women in the emerging European Christian Occident who shared common oppressions with conservative power structures, including the repressive spirit of the Holy Alliance and patriarchal economic and social prejudices against women in an era of gender equality. And so female Philhellenism became an obvious political trend in Europe and the Americas. Women organized lectures and fundraisers. Again, we've heard something about that this week. They sent clothing and supplies to Greece. Those who had it gave jewelry and money. Some came to Greece and stayed after the revolution, involved particularly in establishing education for girls and women. And this morning, Thomas gave us an insight into the organization of humanitarian aid in the US, in which women were greatly involved. So the 1820s became rich with references, memoirs, images, and fashion trends relating to Lascarina Bubelina, produced as much by female Philhellenes as by their better-known male peers. Bubelina intrigued and inspired across borders: a skilled sailor, merchant seawoman, a revolutionary warrior, businesswoman, intellectual, collector, and political player. She transcended the local, national, and became a recognized figure. Culturally, women were influential in creating the brand campaigning identity of popular Philhellenism, to use an anachronism, but it's a useful one. Famously, in France, Greekomania expressed itself in Parisian fashion. Robe de dame à la Boubeline became as ubiquitous as the fashion revolution engendered by the female sans-culotte movement. And when Paris dictated fashion, the women of London, Manchester, New York, and Boston followed. Now, lest the revenant of Mary Wollstonecraft should appear and rebuke me, it was not all about fashion and adornment. The expansion of literacy and print culture was of equal importance as the influence of popular fashion trends. To remind ourselves of just two notable examples, Elisabetta spoke about this week. In 1823, Mavrogenis addresses her appeal to the women of Paris to support the Greeks, and in 1824, she sent her open letter to the ladies of England, soliciting donations and funds to support displaced children and women. And again, as Elisabeth's brilliant work demonstrates, in 1825, Evanthia Keres organizes the appeal by Greek women to the female friends of Greece in America. The signatories request alliance and support from women in America who understand their sufferings, in contrast to those Europeans who turn a blind eye to the massacres, poverty, and misery that plagues Greece. As Carolyn James and Glenda Sluger observe in their collection examining the long international history of women in diplomacy, there is nothing new, of course, about the study of women in international affairs. The dicta of women's history has rarely been in evidence amongst international historians. Turning their attention to gender, many international historians forgot or forewent the importance for looking for the agency that women have exercised in the past, or of using their search for agency as the basis for reflecting on the nature of power in international political concerns. And feminist historians are familiar with tracing the discrete hands of women in world-changing events, as Stella Revas aptly reminds us in the context of her study on the influence of Roxandra Sturzer, again already discussed this morning. Ellie Canham attempts to correlate feminism to nationalism, namely to the stance vis-a-vis the empire. Later Ottoman and Turkish westernization projects, as well as Greek nationalism, required women's mobilization and debated their education, work, and status in the family. This created opportunities for women to claim their rights in the public and private spheres. Canna focuses on the interaction between Greek and Turkish and Muslim feminist interventions in the Ottoman Empire, Greece and Turkey in the mid-19th century and post-Ottoman interwar period. But to do so, she goes back to the 1821 revolution as the wellspring of this sort of feminist decolonization movement throughout the Balkans. These networks, she finds, are synchronous and interconnected. And, she remarks, nationalist women, parenthesis, and some men adopted, by and large, more radical positions on women's rights than did the followers of the imperial model. In his 1860 historical essay on the Greek Revolution, Philemon describes Bubelina as a phenomenon and an exceptional natural being. This is just one of the many examples of male historians, journalists, active participants in the revolution, remarking upon the world's greatest female naval commander and one of their early revolutionary leaders as an extraordinary and intimidating aberration. But exceptionalism, extraordinary unconventional behavior, miraculous deeds, and political demands identified in female figures are merely women taking the opportunity to be themselves, to go about their business and contribute to the world at time of great crisis. It is revolutionary behavior. As that ever-useful philosopher of the subject Lenin remarked, revolutions are the festivals of the oppressed and exploited. At no other time are the people in a position to come forward so actively as creators of a new social order as at a time of revolution. At such times, the people are capable of performing miracles if judged by the narrow Philistine scale of gradual progress. So in the age of revolutions, women taking on unprecedented and unconventional roles, challenging the existing order to the very familial heart of society, is at the core of what made Enlightenment-inspired republicanism, nationalist revolt, and revolution so threatening to those whose power they sought to mitigate or depose. In his regrettably final book, Pirate Enlightenment, the late David Graeber returned to the project that he first laid out in his essay, There Never Was a West. In the language currently fashionable, it might be referred to as a project of decolonizing the Enlightenment. There can be no doubt many of the ideas we now see as products of the 18th century European Lumiere were indeed used to justify extraordinary cruelty, exploitation, and destruction, not just on the working classes at home, but on those who lived in other continents. But the blanket condemnation of the Enlightenment thought is in its own way rather odd, when one considers that this was perhaps the first historically known intellectual movement organized largely by women outside of official institutions like universities, with the express aim of undermining all existing structures of authority. What's more, if one examines many of the original sources, Enlightenment thinkers were often quite explicit that the sources of their ideas lay outside what we now call the Western tradition entirely. So for Graeber, the European Enlightenment was an age of intellectual synthesis where previously intellectual backwaters like England and France suddenly found themselves at the center of global empires, exposed to, for them, startling ideas that they were trying to integrate. For instance, ideas of individualism and liberty drawn from the Americas, a new conception of the bureaucratic state, nation-state largely inspired by China, African contract theories, and economic and social theories originally developed in medieval Islam. All of these converge, as Tolstoy understood, in the post-French Revolutionary wake of the Napoleonic Wars, both territorially and ideologically. And thank you, Ada. We remind ourselves that Tolstoy set out to write a novel about the Decembrists, and found that he had to write a prequel about the Napoleonic Wars. I would argue the most significant point of confluence for early emerging intellectual feminism and practical women's rights is the Greek Revolution. And it's consistent with this twinning of women's rights and nationalism, whether accidentally or intentionally, I don't know, as identified by Elie Canner, that Mark Mazower begins his recent history of the Greek Revolution and the making of modern Europe with the anecdotal encounter between Tsar Alexander and his wife's favorite maid of honor, Roxandra Sturza, later Comtesse Edling Sturza. The two meet at the Tsar's mother-in-law's castle in Germany. Alexander is on his way to the Congress of Vienna, accompanied by his talented young Greek diplomat, yes, we know who it is, Kapodistrias, who he is promoting to be one of his chief advisors in the negotiations. Sturza and Kapodistrias are friends, allies, and some suggest lovers. As Stella Revas documents in her essay about Sturza, Roxandra described her discussion with Alexander in her later memoirs. During the quiet tete-a-tete with the Tsar, she says to him, "Since you treat me with such kindness, sire, I owe you my profession of faith. In the depths of my soul, I am a Republican. I detest courts and have never attached the slightest importance to those distinctions of rank and birth that give me the chills and bore me to death. But please don't betray my secret here, or I could pay dearly." "No, no," replies the Tsar, "have no fear. And to return frankness with frankness, I think absolutely as you do." The Tsar, of course, was no Republican, but he was sympathetic to the Greek cause. He was, after all, the grandson of the Greek-obsessed Catherine the Great. As Mazower observes, it is as though, ancient or modern, to Catherine the Greeks were one. Catherine regarded the superior genius of the ancient Greeks as still living in the modern ones, in other words, a Philhellenic mindset. So Alexander was persuadable to express qualified, usually private gestures of support for the Greek cause. During the Congress, at the personal request of Roxandra, he, Alexander, and his retinue rather controversially attended a Sunday service in a Greek Orthodox church in Vienna, a church built by Stutz's Phanariot family. Given other nationalist uprisings and Republican revolutions smouldering and igniting all over the globe at the time, what was it then about the Greek Revolution specifically that so captured the imagination of the developing women's rights movement? 1821 had something unique and accessible to offer. It had the women of idealized classical antiquity. Warriors, political leaders, goddesses, poets, philosophers, playwrights. It had Bouboulina, the modern Artemisia, and it had female slaves. In short, the iconography and inspiration of an entire cultural cosmology of women at the core of classical Greek literature, philosophy, history, and mythology. As much discussed here, as a campaigning strategy, Philhellenism and its propaganda utilized, developed, and popularized the belief that there was an unbroken continuity between ancient classical Greece and the aims of the modern-day 1821 revolution. Female Philhellens all over Eastern and Central and Western Europe, Scandinavia, Russia, all the Americas, and beyond, came to see the Greek Revolution as the focus point of an opportunity to reimagine and progress the increasingly global conversation about women's rights to education, political participation, citizenship, and equality. From the women-led Parisian salons to the Pisa Circle, at whose center sat political revolutionary Philhellene Mary Shelley, events in Greece were on many women's minds. And I am so looking forward to reading Aristides' The Noblest Cause and finding out so much. I've been waiting for this book for a really long time, so thank you for that. Mary Shelley is still better remembered for a monster than for being the political revolutionary she was. She taught herself, of course, to read and write Greek. She was an ardent, Mary Shelley was an ardent belletrist supporter of the Greek cause, making significant contributions as a translator. And as we discussed earlier, female Philhellenism was a United Kingdom-wide phenomenon. Scottish women led the way with energetic societies in Edinburgh and Aberdeen. Women organised and participated in societies, journals, and committees in the intellectual capital of Manchester and also in London and many other smaller cities and towns. As mentioned above, many of these women were already active in the radical suffrage and anti-slavery abolitionist movements, building on existing networks, particularly linked to nonconformist churches, as Alistair reminded us earlier of the connection with confessional churches and Methodism. Whether in Aberdeen, St. Petersburg, Copenhagen, Stockholm, or Vienna, active church women shared common cause in reconfiguring their faith in relation to republicanism and women's rights. This predisposed them to the religious struggles of the whole of Europe. Metternich and Lord Castlereagh had no time for talk of the rights of peoples or nations, and even less so for the rights of women. Terrified by the French Revolution, these men led the determination to impose or reimpose a conservative order upon a continent, and particularly to reimpose monarchy to repress radicalism, nationalism, and Republican revolution. In their clampdown, the authoritarian, patriarchal Holy Alliance had no desire to progress the rights of women. For women across the world who participated in the Enlightenment, in Ada's wonderful description, a temporal avant-garde, the Greek Revolution reignited a vision of freedom snuffed out after the Napoleonic Wars and the Treaty of the Holy Alliance. For these women, 1821 represented the re-emergence of hopes unrealized in previous revolutions, such as in all the Americas and France. In those, women participated, gained some advances, but never to the extent demanded, promised, or of which they dreamed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a delightful presentation and for putting Bubulina within her right place. Although I will talk about it in the discussion afterwards. Now we will continue with Sίμos Ζένιος from a Zoom presentation. Σίμος Ζένιος is Associate Director of the UCLA Stavros Foundation Center for the Study of Hellenic Culture and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation and Ioannis and Irini Kalogeras Lecturer in Modern Greek Language and Culture. He holds a PhD in Comparative Literature from Harvard University, and his work focuses on the relationship between literature, aesthetics, and political power in the Greek and European literature of the long 19th century. His research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the American School of Classical Studies in Athens and the Friends of Princeton University Library. He has published studies on European Philhellenism, Enlightenment aesthetics and rhetoric, and the work of Dionysios Solomos and Greek modernism in American and European academic journals. We should have a connection. We don't have a connection here. Oh, yes. Hello. Pleased to meet you.
Hello, can you hear me and you can see my presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Charlaptis, for this introduction. I would also like to thank Michalis and Robert Beaton for the organizing of this conference and for their hospitality, which is truly felt even from a computer screen. I wish I could have been there with you to meet everyone and hear everyone's presentations. But I hope that there will be such an opportunity in the future. And I'm very thankful that you're there to hear this presentation of my work. So the question I want to ask today, the two questions I want to ask is, what binds subjects and collectivities together in their revolutionary cause? And the answer will be friendship. And what may cause a revolution to go over and betray its name? And the answer will be friendship again. This, in brief, is the argument that I will be elaborating on today. It is an argument that I trace in the presentations of a Greek revolution in two Philhellenic literary works by major authors of European Romanticism. Friedrich Hölderlin's Hyperion, or The Hermit in Greece, and Percy Bysshe Shelley's Laon and Scythna, or The Revolution of the Golden City. I say presentations, not representations, and a revolution, not the revolution, because both works present fictional versions in varying degrees of revolutions by the Greeks against the Ottoman Empire. The first volume of Hyperion, which was published in 1797, and the second, which was published in 1799, have only a very loose connection to their purported historical setting, the Orloff Revolt of 1770. Laon and Scythna, on the other hand, which was published in 1818, does not have any concrete historical referent. The two works are substantial and ambitious compositions. The narrative of Hyperion extends over 4 books in 2 volumes. The narrator and eponymous central character is sending letters to a German friend from his hermitage in Salamis, recounting the various stages of his life, his relationships with other characters at formative stages of his life, his love for one of these characters, Diotima, the impact of ancient Greece on his formation, and his catastrophic involvement in the 1770 Greek Revolution. Laon and Scythna tells the tale of the titular characters over 12 cantos and 4,818 lines. We read about the happy youth of the siblings, the first revolutionary stirrings in their hearts after coming in contact with the ancient past, They are captured by the tyrant Othman and their respective escapes, the double revolutions against the tyrant they lead, and their death and entry into the allegorical heaven that constitutes the narrative frame of the work. I summarize the plots to remind or inform you about the basic narrative setting and to suggest certain similarities, even at this abstract stage between the two works. Due to their length and complexity, and due to time restrictions, I will not be putting forward today a synthetic development of my argument. My goal is rather more limited, to present some of the dots of the topic that I have set, Philhellenism, friendship, and revolution, and to connect some of the dots of this subset. I draw on studies from intellectual history to suggest why friendship as a sentiment, a type of association between individuals and groups, and as a concept, is important during the age of revolutions and in particular during the French Revolution. This consideration has a second aspect, to suggest why, in addition to being a component of the general program for moral and political renewal that marked the era, friendship was also associated with the excesses of revolutionary action, more concretely, the violent turn of the French Revolution. For our authors, who, as we will see, are preoccupied with the possibility of retaining revolutionary hope and emancipatory praxis in the aftermath of the French Revolution, it is vital to attempt a critique of friendship and separate its emancipatory form from those forms that work against the revolutionary ideal. I will suggest how contemporary theoretical considerations of friendship might also provide some terms that allow us to identify the critique of friendship that Hölderlin and Shelley put forward. Having set this intellectual and theoretical background, I will discuss these two parallel aspects, the development and the critique of revolutionary friendship in Hyperion and Leon and Sithna. Studies by intellectual historians, and I'm thinking here of the work by Marisa Linton and Kenneth Loisel, have examined the inscription of friendship as a virtue in the language of resistance against the old regime in France. Via the mediation of classical republicanism, friendship is understood to be an aspect of the virtuous behavior of a man that is devoted to the public good. The cultivation of virtue and the public spirit was an important component of the program for a moral renewal, and not only an institutional one, that is put forward by intellectuals of the period and during the revolutionary period by revolutionary actors who are steeped in the language of classical antiquity. Friendship contributes to this project by bringing people together as members of a coherent and unified fatherland. It binds them through mutual and chosen bonds, unlike those of kinship and the abstract ones of citizenship. From the perspective of more subversive varieties of politics, I should also remind here the connection between friendship and anti-tyrannical politics, a frequent topos in political and literary discourses from antiquity to early modernity and to the revolutionary era. I provide here on this slide some of the many quotes that abound, especially in Hyperion, that make a very conscious reference to this tradition. I should also like to point out the connection between friendship and fraternity, that third component of the French revolutionary motto. Fraternity itself undergoes significant semantic changes at the time, as suggested by studies from scholars like Lin Han and Mona Ozouf. In the early part of the revolution, fraternity indicated an inclusive bond of solidarity that was owed to the entirety of mankind. Progressively, however, and in the new historical context of the revolutionary wars and the radicalization of the revolution, it acquires additional and restricted connotations. Especially during the period of terror, in Jacobin and some culotte circles, it acquires more restricted significations. It denotes the affective devotion that one feels towards members of the same group, and, more specifically, towards those with whom one shares experiences and a shared political vision. Returning momentarily to Hyperion and to Leon and Sithna, it is useful to keep in mind that both works can be read as responses by radical poets who, inspired by the great promise of the French Revolution, tried to provide imaginative accounts of its failings and the ways in which the emancipatory hope that it ushered may be kept alive despite any disillusionment. If, in Hölderlin's case, we can surmise as such, both from the content of the novel and from the fact that he began working on it in 1792, right as soon as the period of terror began, in Shelley's case, the connection to the French Revolution is made explicit. In the preface to the work, Shelley asks his readers to treat the work as, and I quote, an experiment on the temper of the public mind as to how far a thirst for a happier condition of moral and political society survives among the enlightened and refined, the tempests which have shaken the age in which we live, end quote. The political aspects of friendship and its systematic thematization and problematization in Hyperion and in Leon and Sithna indicate that the examination of the topic might provide an entry point into the critical engagement of these works with the revolutionary tradition. Pursuing this possibility, and in addition to the intellectual background I described, I also draw on Jacques Derrida's theorization of friendship in his 1994 Politics of Friendship. More specifically, I am interested in two moments of Derrida's deconstructive examination of friendship. The first involves what he calls the Greco-Roman model of friendship. This model, and again I quote, seems to be governed by the value of reciprocity, by homological, immanentist, finitist, and rather politicist concord, end quote. This conception of friendship follows a logic of sameness and proximity, where friends resemble each other and share much in common. The second aspect of Derrida's argument I'm interested in concerns the use of the term fraternity to describe ideal friendships throughout the history of the concept. This is a terminological and metaphorical choice that, as Derrida suggests, situates ideal friendships in the domain of natural relations and primarily in relations among men. Structures and images of similarity, sameness, and identity are consistently deployed in the two works that I will be discussing today in order to describe relationships among friends. I consider the following to be central notes in the development and critique of revolutionary friendship. First, the very understanding of the relationship between revolutionary subjects as one that is primarily based on friendship. Second, the similarities between the transformative effect of friendship and the dynamism that inhabits the relationships between educator and student. Relationships of education abound both in these works, but also in numerous Philhellenic works of the time. The third aspect of the argument that I am interested in is the development of a model of revolutionary friendship that can accommodate otherness. The fourth and final one is the articulation or the narrative advancement of this model, the model of friendship that is based on otherness, by female characters specifically. Now, each of these topics could be the subject of a separate presentation. In what remains in the main part of my presentation, I will only focus in documenting the first note, that is, the use of the category of friendship in order to describe the relationships that develop between revolutionary subjects and, crucially, the conception of this friendship as something that might lead to a type of violence that betrays revolution by setting its means against its ends. I begin with Hyperion. The first volume of the novel is structured around a series of successive relationships that prove crucial for the development of the titular character. The revolutionary moment, however, rather the initiation in the revolution, in the strict sense, consists in the encounter between Hyperion and Alabanda, another fellow Greek who lives in Smyrna. while the relationship between Hyperion and Alabanda, excuse me just a second. The relationship between Hyperion and Alabanda, as I said, provides the ground for the initiation of the titular character who up until that point lived a life in nature into the revolutionary cause. The two friends, and they are declared as friends as such, with a ferocious intensity from the first moments of their encounter, which you can see in the first passage on the slide, soon start thinking together about their colossal revolutionary projects. You can see the passage there on you can see the relevant passages on the second citation from the novel, which specifically shows Alabanda as the initiator of Hyperion into the revolution. Notice the imagery of unity that is offered by Hyperion when reflecting on his relation with Alabanda in the following passage, which I read. Our souls were bound to be all the more powerfully drawn together because they'd been unwillingly closed off from one another. We met like two streams that come rolling down the mountain and hurl aside the ballast of earth and stones and rotten wood and all the sluggish mess that holds them back, clearing the way to each other and bursting through to where, embracing and embrace with equal force, they mingle into one majestic river and begin their wandering course into the vastness of the sea. The identity between the two is posited and desired by Hyperion later in the novel in a language couched in the tropological field of fraternal relations. You can see this in passage 4, where Hyperion, awaiting his reunion with Alabanda after a period of separation, says, "The kingly youth, why was I born later? Why did I not spring with him from one cradle? I cannot suffer the difference that's between us." Returning though to the image of the river in the third passage, we may observe that if the force of the rushing river seems to capture something that belongs to the revolutionary character of Alabanda, the lack of will in this association of natural bodies of water may suggest the strong pull that Alabanda exerts on Hyperion. The relationship, therefore, is not quite reciprocal, and Alabanda's positions, even when not completely adopted by Hyperion, take priority. I'm going to present this passage, which shows precisely the weak resistance that Hyperion is able to put forward to Alabanda's much more radical and much more violent means towards achieving revolution. I quote from Alabanda, "What? The god shall depend on the worm? The god in us for whom the path to infinity beckons shall stand and wait till the worm gets out of his way? No, no, we don't ask whether you're willing. You never are, you slaves and barbarians. Nor will we try to change you for the better, for that's a waste of effort. We just want to see to it you make way for the triumphant march of man. Oh, let someone light the torch for me that I may sear the wheat from the heath. Let the mine be made for me that I may blast the sluggish clods from the earth." And you can see the weak and quite gentle resistance that Hyperion offers, as I mentioned. Where possible, you push them gently aside. I interjected. Hyperion narrates. This is a prelude to Hyperion's catastrophic engagement with violent revolutionary action that is narrated in the third book of the novel. Obviously, Alabanda's friendship has managed to suppress Hyperion's otherness, and it has led to the failure of the revolution and then to the subsequent reconsideration of revolutionary means for Hyperion. I set this novel aside to turn to Leon and Sithna, and I would like to draw attention to some similar structures that abound in Shelley's romance. The first one is the fact that the eponymous character, Leon, is simultaneously the subject that comes to revolutionary consciousness and the subject that tries to initiate others. In other words, if we were to compare the subject positions to those in Hyperion, Laon occupies the positions of both Hyperion and Alabanda. His revolutionary awakening begins when he comes in contact with and reflects on the ruins of antiquity that he encounters in his homeland. In his critique of the situation of subjection, we should note that the corrosive effect of oppression, which poisons ruler and ruled alike in a gesture that is characteristically Shelleyan, is presented as a strange fellowship, that is, as distorted relations. It therefore follows naturally that when Leon seeks to initiate others to the revolutionary course, he understands this, as you can see in passage 2, as the creation of relations of friendship and sympathy. I also note the use of bondage to describe these associations that will be affected by Leon's words. It does not only serve as a premonition to the violence that will follow, but it also prepares the ground for the next steps of the narrative, where it is indicated that the friends that Leon seeks are, must be, and should be similar or identical to him. The use of the topos of fraternity in order to describe the association that his words bring into being reads natural within such a context. And you see in passage 3 the language of fraternity, in which Leon's attempts to create revolutionary solidarity are very much described as familiar relationships, even though they are in other passages of this canto they are described as fraternal. The affective intensity and the desire for unity describes them here as relations of brotherhood and as being children of one great mother. It is therefore not surprising that Leon's most loyal student, the one who most readily adopts his revolutionary calling, is his younger sibling, Sithna, his younger sister. Sithna appears in the narrative after Leon has grown disappointed with his failed attempts to create relations of solidarity and friendship. In his words, friends had now become perilous and false. In Leon's description of Sithna, and we should always be mindful that we are hearing Leon's words describing Sithna and not Leon's understanding, and not Sithna's understanding of herself, Sithna is called his only friend, and the reader may observe a persistent positing not only of similarity between the two, but of an identity that is premised on Sithna's passive absorption of Leon's ideas. I have many examples here that you can see. I'm only going to read like two very characteristic ones. When Sithna is first described in Canto 2, Leon says, "As mine own shadow was this child to me, a second self far dearer and more fair." Or we can see in the second passage, "Her spirit over the ocean's floating state, from her deep eyes far wandering on the wing of visions that were mine beyond its utmost spring." In these passages, we see what Andrew Warren has analyzed as Leon's initial solipsism and solitude extended into an understanding of friendship that precludes the admittance of differences and the lack of complete identity of the other to the speaking subject, to the original friend and initiator into the revolution. While Sithna, after her capture from the tyrant, will display a different behavior that opens her to otherness and thus to being the leader of a non-violent revolution in the later cantos of the poem, it is not, I think, a matter of chance that Shelley presents this self-enclosed Leon, both reacting violently to Sithna's capture and being prepared later on to lead the violent revolution. A consideration of how Sithna achieves this would lead us from the critique of revolutionary friendship of identity to the reconstruction of the revolutionary friendship with otherness. As I suggested, it would ask us to consider the role that female characters play, themselves other to the male characters that we encounter in the major part of each narrative, the role they play, these characters, in bringing about this alternative model of friendship. Now, this will be the topic of another presentation and of a lengthier treatment that is possible here. To conclude, my goal here was more limited. First, to identify revolutionary friendship as a problem that bears further consideration in these specific literary works. Second, to provide some historical context on why this might have been the case at this specific period. And third, to test a certain theoretical perspective in the analysis of these literary texts. Hyperion and Leon and Sithma have rarely been discussed together, despite their numerous similarities and despite the intellectual affinities of their authors. This joint consideration finds a hospitable setting in the broader field of Philhellenic research, since the latter enables the articulation of interdisciplinary approaches, a historical orientation that should mark any humanistic inquiry, and the connection to broader intellectual and literary currents. It stands, therefore, and this has been a second implicit goal of my research, as a demonstration, a convincing one, I hope, of the dynamism of the field. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Zenios, and for this very interesting approach. And we will continue with Maria Kalinowska, Professor of History at the History of Literature at the Faculty of Artes Liberales of the University of Warsaw. She is the author of many books on the Romanticism, Philhellenism, and Romantic reception of culture and classical antiquity. In 2020, she obtained a Lord Byron Medal from the Society of Hellenism and Philhellenism in Athens. Today, she will talk to us about between universality and particularity, the 1821 Greek uprising from the perspective of Polish Philhellenism, literature, journalism, and political discourse.
Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Είμαι πάρα πολύ ευχαριστημένη που είμαι εδώ. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ τους οργανωτές για την πρόσκληση αυτό το υπέροχο συνέδριο. Ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Maybe I check it. It's okay. The Greek and global celebration of the bicentenary of the Greek Revolution is impressive in its scope. I believe that what emerges from the celebration is the still relevant idea of European integration around its Greek beginnings and contemporary Europe's around the category of freedom and democracy. The bicentenary of the Greek uprising has also made its mark in Poland through major cultural and academic events. Our research on Philhellenism has been in progress for many years, and 2 volumes that the team I lead published some time ago launched, I believe, a new stage in research on Polish Philhellenism. I would like to devote my talk to outline our latest projects. I think they serve to highlight the unique nature of Polish Philhellenism. At one of the Greek bicentenaries conferences, I recounted a Philhellenic episode from the life of Romantic Polish poet Seweryn Goszczyński. This Philhellenic experience in his life is extremely significant. It can serve as a good illustration of various elements of the Polish Romantics Philhellenism. Seweryn Goszczyński, a mere Polish poet born in Ukraine, who later took part in the Polish uprising of 1830, intended to fight in the Greek uprising and traveled from Warsaw to Odessa on foot with this aim. Unfortunately, his plan failed. Pursued by the Tsarist police for his underground activity, he hid out near Human in Ukraine, only venturing outside at night, including to the famous Zofiówka Park, that a Polish aristocrat, Count Potocki, had earlier founded for his Greek wife. Here in Human in 1824, Goszczyński wrote his poem A Night in Zofiówka, which is essentially a record of the inner journey of a romantic pondering, the laws of history and the nature of his own existence. In the somber scenery of a dark cosmic night, there appears a vision of Greek fighting. This vision has a much more fundamental, wider, or essentially mythical dimension, perhaps even an apocalyptic one. Goszczyński was a poet influenced by Byron, focusing his attention on revolutionary events from Poland's history, events always connected with the quest for freedom. The image of the Greek insurrection is thus an original and extremely rare vision, even in Byronic context. This picture of the Greek uprising arises, as the poet himself says, in his soul. What it reveals is a very personal perception of the Greek insurrection and at the same time the reception of the Greek cause as being very universal. What could have prompted the 20-year-old poet to abandon his current life and go on foot to Greece to take part in the uprising? What role did Philhellenism play in the lives of Polish participants in the Greek Revolution? The Philhellenic episode of the life of an outstanding romantic Polish poet highlights several themes important for Polish Philhellenism. The connection between political pro-independence activity and literature, extremely strong Byronic inspiration, and the similar situation of the two enslaved nations, Poles and Greeks, fighting against aggressive empires, and the stimulation of the Romantic poet's imagination by the Greek insurgent fighting. A book I present to you today comes in two versions, Polish English and Greek English. It has been published in association with and thanks to substantial help from Ms. Rosina Wawecki, mayor of Arta, and Kyrios Konstantinos Velentsas, the organizer of the magnificent Philhellenism Museum in Athens. We are very grateful to them. In our team, there are scholars from all over Poland. In this volume, we approach Philhellenism in a narrow sense, similarly to Professor Lukia Drulia, as well as in a wider framework. Philhellenism became a great literary and cultural movement, rich and diverse. Polish Philhellenes fighting in Greece most often took part in the struggle for Poland's independence as well. Many Polish Philhellenes continued their struggle for a free Poland after 1831 as emigres, some of them having death sentences from the Tsarist oppressors. One might say that Polish Philhellenes fighting for or supporting the Greek cause belonged to the mythical country of Romantic poetry. They were the mad people, of course, in a positive Romantic sense, about whom the greatest Polish poet Adam Mickiewicz wrote in Paris that it was they, accused of madness and belligerence, but faithful to their conscience, who supported the liberation cause rather than reasonable people. In our book, the biographies of Polish participants in the Greek uprising are the subject of the text by Professor Gościwit-Malinowski, who has managed to establish many new facts and identify many forgotten Polish Philhellenes who fought in Greece. The following factors determined the uniqueness of Polish Philhellenism. The political, at first, political situation of Poland. Second, a fascination with antiquity that was important for Polish national culture, noble national culture. The special importance of Byron for Polish Romanticism and remembrance of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's war with Turkey in the 17th century. The book shows the main directions of our research of Philhellenism in a broad sense, especially literary Philhellenism. Our field of interest includes the greatest Polish romantic poets, Adam Mickiewicz, Juliusz Słowacki, Krasiński, as well as other Philhellene poets. Other major areas include rapidly developing research on the Polish reception of modern Greek songs and on the press of the time as it followed the Greek insurgent struggle. In recent years, we have frequently revisited the oeuvre of the late Romantic Cyprian Norwid, one of the most important Polish poets also today, and thinkers. He wrote in it's also his picture, and he was also a poet and painter. He wrote in 1875, recalling the enthusiasm of the Europeans several decades before. Everyone, absolutely everyone, sent Greece their most selfless feelings, songs, gold, exceptional people, and freedom. According to Norwid, this enthusiasm for the Greek cause united all of Europe. Norwid shows what Greece's freedom meant to the whole of Europe and what it meant to Poland, which had lost its independence at the end of the 18th century. First and foremost, it was a question of the identity of European as heirs of the Greek classical tradition, with its focus on respect for the human individual, for freedom and democracy, but also for the category of beauty that Europe learned from Homer and Phidias. In one of his Greek poems written on the shores of Crete, at the time of the revolution of 1848, Norwid speaks of the ancient Greek culture as a mystic bread shared by nations. Professor Małgorzata Borowska, a leading Hellenist and translator of Greek literature, shows, using example of Gazeta Krakowska newspaper, how important information about the Greeks' insurgents, battles, was to Poles, and the role of the press in disseminating Philhellenic ideas in Poland. It's very interesting quotation and translation text from newspaper, Warsaw newspaper in 1821. It's very interesting because the author, anonymous author, wrote about Polish attitude toward Turks and Greek liberation. I'd like to take this opportunity to show you one more point of view in the research of our faculty and our team. It's a book of Dr. Eva Janion on Philhellenism and gender, gender relations, and she published several studies about it. Knowing about historical context, it is not hard to understand that, please tell me when 5 minutes, when I have 5 minutes. It's not hard to understand that the image of Greece in Polish Romantic literature is dominated by themes related to the independence struggle and a sense of shared historical fate. I must add that Greek models played a very important role in 19th century Polish political discussions, both ancient, especially Spartan exemplars, and those from modern Greece, and political as well as ethical role models. Most of the Polish romantics had a very good classical education, and additionally, many of them, especially student of Vilnius University, Adam Mickiewicz among those students, found themselves within the orbit of German Neo-Hellenism through Professor Ernest Grodek in particular. We should also add that the Polish Romantics' fascination with Greece was influenced by the exceptionally rich and intense reception of Byron, who was loved in Poland almost as much as he was in Greece. The famous initial passage about enslaved Greece from Giaur is in a translation by Mickiewicz, the most important, as I said, Polish poet, was also interpreted as a mask for the Polish cause. The parallel drawn between the history of Greece and the history of Poland is the Polish version of the Romantic worship of Greece as a symbol of freedom. The 1821 Greek Revolution gave the Poles hope that Poland would regain its independence, not in a short-term political way, but in the sphere of moral ideas and in terms of the ethicization of international relations. I would like to underline this aspect of establishing political relations on a clearly ethical foundation. Analyzing Paul's perception of the Greek uprising as an event of universal character that goes beyond a single nation's cause, we also need to underline the role of the Polish diplomat, aristocrat, writer, and very important politician for several decades of the 19th century, Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, who showed his support for the Greek cause in various ways. His political manifesto, signed Philhellen, contained a program for the creation of a universal political order based on the laws of nations and above all on ethical principles. In a Greek Revolution, thus appears in Polish Romanticism in at least 3 dimensions: a broad Philhellenic and Byronian perspective, universal dimension through a connecting with ancient models, and 3, as a mask of Polish independence aspiration. The Greece, 5 minutes? Okay. The Greece-Poland motif in the work of the greatest Polish romantic Philhellenic poet Juliusz Słowacki is of exceptional importance for Polish culture. Greece juxtaposed with, in his output, Greece juxtaposed with Poland, Greece as a model for Poland, and Greece as a mask for Polish national problems are themes appearing in all periods of his oeuvre. We can see map with her tour, her journey to Greece and to Holy Land, not just a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but also precisely a pilgrimage to the ideal of Greece as a homeland of freedom and beauty. It was to Greece that Słowacki devoted a poem he wrote during his journey, most probably during a fortnight stay on the Syros. Maybe, by the way, I would like to say that maybe this journey had a political background. There is a hypothesis that this journey was involved with political plans of Adam Czartoryski. It's a manuscript of this poem he wrote on Syros, and there are the names of Ypsilantis, Botzaris, Canaris. By the way, I must say that Słowacki visited Canaris, and he met Dionysos Solomos during his cruise to Ionian Island. Recalling his memories of useful reading of tales about the deeds of the new Greece fighters, including the Ypsilantis brothers, Botzaris, Canaris, Zavelas, Miaulis, the poet on his journey builds an unusual picture of both the Greek struggle for independence and the poet's inner world. Maybe Słowacki, fascinated by Greek heroes who form a kind of chain of freedom-fighting tradition by Hellas, above all, identified with its defenders, Prometheus, Miltiades, Themistocles, Leonidas, Canaris, mythical and historical, early and modern figures fascinate the poet within their bravery and heroism. At the end of my presentation, I would like to show you another publication. It's 2 volumes publication. It's this diary from journey of Słowacki. This notebook disappeared during the Second World War, and our colleague from our team, Professor Głębocki, found it in Moscow library. So we published it, and we wrote about this notebook. I complete. It's okay. Thank you.